Good morning. As Linda said, I'm Deborah Layer. I want to welcome you all and Mr. Joseph Pearce to our educational series for South Carolina Cursillo. Mr. Pearce is a parishioner of Prince of Peace Catholic Church in Taylor, South Carolina. Joseph is senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. He's director of book publishing at the Augustine Institute, editor of St. Austin's Review, and the series editor at Ignatius Critical Editions. He's the author of numerous books, which include subjects on the Catholicness of Shakespeare, J.R.R. Tolkien, Oscar Wilde, C.S. Lewis, and the Catholic Church, GK Chesterton, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, among others. The topic of Mr. Pearce's talk today is heroic holiness and the light of Christ in dark times. I present Joseph Pearce.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me on this Saturday morning as we look at one of the great heroes and converts to Christianity of the last century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And as was mentioned in Deborah's brief introduction there, that I have actually written a book on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, so I should be drawing on my experience of that. And also I was very blessed. One of the greatest blessings of my life was to actually travel to Russia back in 1998 to meet and interview him for my book. So basically my talks have been two halves. Now they probably won't be halves, but two parts. The first will be an objective look at the importance of this great man and the witness he bears to us, for us in the 21st century, the lessons we can learn from tyranny and secular fundamentalism and anti-Christianity that was rampant during the 20th century, and see how that is applicable to our own lives and through the example of this very courageous man. So the first part of the talk would be an objective look at who Alexander Solzhenitsyn was, why he's important, not only to 20th century history, to helping to bring down the tyranny of the Soviet Union and the communist empire, but also how that is applicable to our own times in which we find ourselves today. And then the second part will be a subjective look at my own experience of Solzhenitsyn, why he was so important to me in my own journey to Christ, and about my impressions of him when I met him. And I'm going to try to keep all of that to about 45 minutes because, first of all, that's long enough for anybody to have to listen to me. But also, I want to leave time for Q&A. So the one thing I would ask is that you be thinking, perhaps, of some good questions while I'm speaking. So when we get to the Q&A part, it will be dynamic. Sometimes the Q&A session can be the most exciting part of the whole presentation. So, but that depends upon the quality of the questions as well as the quality of the answers. So bear that in mind. So let me begin with some questions, which we will endeavor to answer. Well-known questions, but conundrums, mysteries. Do great men make history? Or does history make great men? Well, one thing which is absolutely beyond doubt is that history smothers great men and women. You think of the trenches of World War I and how many of the great men that might have been were killed in the trenches, never to see the light of day. There's a wonderful poem by Thomas Gray, written in the 18th century, called Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which really talks about, the great men that are really smothered by circumstance. So history can smother great men, but do great men make history, and does history make great men? Okay, and the other priceless lessons that we're going to learn from the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the answer to two absolutely crucial questions as regards the sort of society that we need to be living in. First is a statement by Lord Acton, a 19th century English political philosopher. And he said, and you probably know this, this famous saying, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So the danger of putting power into the hands of the wrong people or too few people, or into the hands of people with pernicious, poisonous, anti-Christian agendas. And then the other one is by an 18th century political philosopher, Edmund Burke. And he presents us with a paradox almost worthy of that great man there, GK Chesterton. So Edmund Burke says, liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. And so there's a paradox, all right? If you actually want to possess liberty, somehow you also have to limit it so that can happen. Absolute freedom leads to slavery. So, and a third statement, which sets the scene for us here, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde said that anarchy is freedom's own Judas. Anarchy is freedom's own Judas. It betrays freedom with a kiss, with a traitor's kiss, because in the absence of any law, the gangs take over, the most ruthless take over. And then the only way you can get rid of that chaos of being ruled by basically gang leaders, the most ruthless, most tyrannical, is with another tyrant who comes in and clears them away. So anarchy is the presagure for tyranny. So these are things we need to bear in mind, because Alexander Solzhenitsyn lived in times that prove the truth of those statements. So the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn throws light on these questions and helps us to understand not only history and the nature of power, but our own times and the nature of man himself, who we are as human beings. Indeed, I would suggest that understanding Solzhenitsyn will help us understand ourselves. So who was Alexander Solzhenitsyn? Well, again, in my book, this is actually the UK edition. Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. The Ignatius Press edition looks different from that. Same book, basically, but there's an early chapter in it called Child of the Revolution. And the reason that's the chapter title is because Alexander Solzhenitsyn was born on the 11th of December, 1918. Now, those of you that know your history know that the Bolshevik Revolution happened in October 1917. So he was born literally only 14 months after the revolution, and was born into this communist, atheistic system and grew up in it. And the key element of Solzhenitsyn's life where he comes to wisdom is actually through suffering. In other words, Solzhenitsyn's life shows us that it's only through the crucifixion that we come to the resurrection. This is something he learns as he goes on, but suffering is something which accompanies him throughout his life. So even the 9 months that he was in his mother's womb were turbulent, because his father died when his mother was only 3 months pregnant. So he was born without a father. And then on the 5th of September, 1918, so when his mother is pregnant with him for 6 months, this is all happening while he's still in the womb, the decree of the Red Terror, as it became known, was passed on the 5th of September, 1918, calling for the mass executions of those who opposed the communist system, and authorized the new Soviet Republic to defend itself against its enemies by isolating them in concentration camps. So this is the world in which Solzhenitsyn is born. So he has a vague memories as he's growing up of the faith, Christian faith of his mother and of his aunts. Some of his earliest memories of icons on the walls of the family home. But there was no private education in the Soviet Union. It was a public school system with dogmatic ideology, dogmatic Marxist, atheist, anti-Christian ideology, which was taught to every single child. So Solzhenitsyn grew up in blissful ignorance of the deeper truths of reality, and became, first of all, an atheist and a communist. And at the age of 11, he joined the Young Pioneers, which was the youth movement of the Soviet Communist Party. So he goes off to fight in World War II as part of the advance of the Red Army across Eastern Europe in the final months of the war, as the Germans are in retreat. And it was his experience of the suffering caused by tyranny upon civilians as the Red Army marched through Eastern Europe that what he called the first most important and defining moment in his life. So there are, he names 3 important moments of his life that were life-changing, and they're all connected to suffering. So let me give an example from this. There's a horrific war poem that Solzhenitsyn wrote called Prussian Nights, which he reminisces about his experiences on the Eastern Front in World War II. And this is just one example of the horrors that he saw and witnessed. So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. At the beginning of Prussian Nights, the jingoistic praise of Russia's glorious advance is soon overshadowed as the fiery fingers groping for revenge claw across the foul witch of Germany. The narrative sweeps and sways almost drunkenly as Solzhenitsyn describes the wanton destruction of villages, churches, farms, and farm animals. It is an exultant chaos. Amid the flames, the narrator almost unwillingly begins to perceive something metaphysically infernal in the physical inferno all about him. It is portentous evil, temptingly work of a devil. As Stalin's edict is carried out with gusto, but if Stalin basically told the Soviet soldiers in the Red Army, just take revenge on the Germans. In other words, there would be no mercy, which is why the civilian population were fleeing, because the men were all killed and the women were all raped and then usually killed afterwards, as we shall see in a moment. As Stalin's edict is carried out with gusto, the narrator stands aloof. He has no vengeance in his heart, but like Pilate, when he washed his hands, will do nothing to quench the flames. Not quite honestly that he could do anything to quench the flames. Prussian Nights also recounts a scene of inhumanity which exceeds in its shocking precision anything achieved by Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon in their war poems about the First World War. The narrator comes across a house which has not been burned, just looted, rifled, where he hears a moaning by the walls half muffled. Inside, he finds a mother and her little daughter. The mother is wounded but still alive. The daughter is dead, having suffered beforehand a fate worse than death. She lies lifeless on a mattress, the victim of a mass rape, and the narrator wonders how many Russian soldiers had lain on top of the girl's battered body before she died. A platoon, perhaps? A company? A girl's been turned into a woman turned into a corpse. The mother, her eyes hazy and bloodshot, has been blinded in the vain struggle to save herself and her daughter. She has nothing to live for and begs the narrator, a soldier she can hear but not see, to kill her. Neither is this the only sickening account of mass rape depicted in the narrative. A few pages later, the anarchic invaders come across a rich house full of German virgins, ignoring the desperate pleas of the women that they are not Germans but Polish. There is a description of the cold-blooded murder of an elderly woman and her bedridden husband. The poem concludes with the narrator finally succumbing to the temptations all around him. He rapes a woman compliant from fear who, when the ordeal is over, begs him not to shoot her. Sickened with remorse and knowing that it is too late to rectify the wrong he has done, he feels the burden of another's soul weighing heavily on his own. The climactic evil he has perpetrated has left him unfulfilled, unsatisfied. All that remains is an anticlimax of guilt intensified into futility. I would say one thing there, by the way, just it doesn't necessarily mean that Solzhenitsyn himself was that rapist. The poem is a composite of experiences that he got from while he was in the Soviet prison system, of the wartime experience. He collected all together and made this dramatic war poem from it. But I mean, that I wrote that, I've read it several times. It still gives me the creeps. And this is the sort of, if you like, the dark underbelly of war, which we very rarely get to see. But this, for Solzhenitsyn, was illuminating, because no more could he believe naively about the glorious Soviet Union. That if Joseph Stalin had unleashed this satanic power upon a defenseless civilian population, he was not to be idolized and worshipped. So for Solzhenitsyn, suffering is the price we have to pay in order to come to enlightenment, in order to actually come to see reality. So the second most important and defining moment happened very soon afterwards, because in a private letter to a friend, Solzhenitsyn wrote a couple of sentences that were mildly critical of Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. And of course, there's no such thing as private correspondence in a totalitarian regime. The letter was opened and read, and for that crime of privately criticizing the government, he was sentenced to 7 years hard labor. So in my book, there's a chapter, and using sort of a pun, called Arrested Development, because the paradox was it took his arrest to actually lead to progress, because before this he was living in a delusional world where communism was good. When he's arrested by the Soviet system, tortured, treated abysmally, and then thrown into labor camps, the light completely comes on. He sees the horror of the Soviet Union. So this arrest, in which all of his plans, he's married, his plans to be a great author, he's a mathematician, all of his worldly ambitions come crumbling down to ashes, to nothing. And that for him, it was a blessing, because it was another crucifixion that led to a resurrection of the soul. He spent 7 years in the Soviet prison system, which he would call, in the title of his book, the Gulag Archipelago. So Gulag is a Russian word for prison, or it's actually an acronym, I think, for the prison system. An archipelago, of course, is a group of islands. So all across the Soviet Union were these islands that were prisons, containing millions of prisoners, many of whom were political prisoners and committed no crime except being non-compliant to the will of the Communist Party. So this 7 years in the Soviet prison system, again, is a title in one of the chapters in my book, Hell into Purgatory. And Solzhenitsyn is very aware of Dante as a backdrop to this, as we shall see in a moment. So hell into purgatory, that basically the hell of the prison system becomes purgatory, because it's in this prison system that he suffers his own purgation, accepts the cleansing that comes through suffering, and moves closer to objective truth and ultimately to God. And so the other a chapter about this period is called Profit from Loss. He needed to actually lose everything in order to profit from that loss. And then we have another perfect example of the courage of the man and the integrity, because he's a mathematician. So when the Soviet prison system they realize they have this man who has mathematical gifts. He's taken out of the Soviet labor camps where the survival rate was very small. They basically worked people to death, and put in a comfortable prison where he was doing research. And Solzhenitsyn writes a novel about this, and it's called First Circle, which is named after the first circle of Dante's Divine Comedy, First Circle of Hell, where the people there don't actually suffer. They're relatively comfortable, but nonetheless, they're in hell and they're never going anywhere else. And Solzhenitsyn's novel, you know, is semi-autobiographical. So the character of Gleb Nershin in that novel is Solzhenitsyn. And so he realizes what they're being used to develop technology which will enable the government to listen in on phone calls and have voice recognition to know who it is that's speaking. That's the technology on which he's working. And he realized he's becoming a collaborator with the enemy, a collaborator with the devil. So he refuses to continue the work, chooses thereby to be thrown once again back into the labor camp system. And then after 7 years of imprisonment, he is released. He's not allowed to go home. He's released into internal exile. So he's still hundreds and hundreds of miles from home. But nonetheless, of course, freedom is freedom from prison. Could have been happy, except it's exactly this moment, he has a diagnosis of cancer that's believed to be terminal. He only has a few months to live. And he calls this the third and final, most important and defining moment of his life. Again, suffering, experiencing the suffering of and the horrors of World War II, experiencing the arrest and the crumbling of all of his worldly ambitions, and now the prospect of near imminent death. And it's this close encounter with death taught him the value of life. And it was at this time, 1952, just before he's released from prison, that he has his conversion to Christianity. And I want to read the part of the book that deals with this. So there's this, he meets someone in prison just shortly before he's released, Dr. Boris Kornfeld, and he's a Jewish man who has converted to Christianity. And this man, as he listened to Solzhenitsyn, was astonished at the conviction of the new convert, the ardor of his words. And this is a quote. And on the whole, do you know, I have become convinced that there is no punishment that comes to us in this life on earth which is undeserved. Superficially, it can have nothing to do with what we are guilty of in actual fact. But if you go over your life with a fine tooth comb and ponder it deeply, you will always be able to hunt down that transgression of yours for which you have now received this blow. Thus, Kornfeld ended the account of his conversion experience, and Solzhenitsyn shuddered at the mystical knowledge in his voice. Solzhenitsyn must have shuddered again the following morning when he was awoken by the sound of running about and trampling in the corridor. The orderlies were carrying Kornfeld's body to the operating room. He had been dealt 8 blows to the skull with a plasterer's mallet while he slept and died on the operating table without regaining consciousness. A quote from Solzhenitsyn. And so it happened that Kornfeld's prophetic words were his last words on earth. And directed to me, they lay upon me as an inheritance. You cannot brush off that kind of inheritance by shrugging your shoulders. I skip a bit here because I don't want to read too much. So this is his commentary upon those words of Kornfeld, which seem very harsh, right? There's nothing, no suffering we get, which basically we don't deserve. So he asks questions. Did that mean that he and the millions of other prisoners in Stalin's camps were more evil than those who had escaped their miserable fate? In other words, if you suffer more, does that mean you're more guilty than those who suffer less? Did it mean that those who suffered an even worse fate, such as tortuously slow death, were the most evil people of all? Worse, did it mean that those who committed the torture were less evil than their victims? And what of those who prospered rather than suffered? What of the malicious criminals he had met in various camps over the years? What of the camp guards? Worst of all, what of Stalin himself? Did it mean that Stalin was less evil than the millions of innocents he had slaughtered? Surely not. What of the torturers, Solzhenitsyn asked? Why does not fate punish them? Why do they prosper? And this is the quote. And the only solution to this would be that the meaning of earthly existence lies not, as we have grown used to thinking, in prospering, but in the development of the soul. From that point of view, our torturers have been punished most horribly of all. They are turning into swine. They are departing downward from humanity. From that point of view, punishment is inflicted on those whose development holds out hope. In other words, the crucifixion can lead to resurrection for those who have humility. And the way I sometimes talk about this is the whole of humanity is on Golgotha when Christ is crucified. And we often think about that in terms of, yes, of course, I'm nailing him to the cross with my sins. We're there in that sense. But I would say also, we're there also being nailed to the cross. We're either the good thief or we're the bad thief. Because it's impossible to go through life without suffering. It's impossible to go through life without actually being crucified ourselves. It's what do we do with the suffering when we receive it that matters. Are we like the bad thief and blame everybody else, including God, for our suffering? Or are we like the good thief who says that, you know, I'm guilty of many sins and I deserve to be suffering. You are the innocent one, Christ. You're the innocent one on the cross. We're not innocent ones on the cross. We are sinners who are being suffering. And for that, Christ says to the man on the cross beside him, this night you will be with me in paradise. The other man, well, perhaps we shouldn't even go where he might be going, even in our imagination. Having passed beyond Kornfeld's theory, Solzhenitsyn could look back at it from the other side. From this new angle, he saw that for individuals in their one-to-one relationship with the Creator, the theory actually held true. Quote, but there was something in Kornfeld's last words that touched a sensitive chord that I accept quite completely for myself. And many will accept the same for themselves. So don't talk about whether other people deserve to be suffering more than you or less than you. Just have your relationship with God and see that suffering is something which is an opportunity if embraced with humility. All alone in the recovery room in the camp hospital from which Kornfeld had gone to his death, Solzhenitsyn passed long, sleepless nights, pondering with astonishment his own life and the turns it had taken. For the first time, he seemed fully awake, fully alive to the sublime realities at the root of his personal experiences. At last, all the doubts, all the shadows seemed to disappear and everything appeared resolved, crystal clear. Slowly, as the interminable minutes passed, he set down his thoughts in rhymed verses. I'm going to read this. This is about his conversion to Christianity. When did I so utterly, totally strew the good grain like chaff to the winds and shun those same temples where all through my youth I was lulled by your radiant hymns? My dazzling book-garnered wisdom proved more than this arrogant brain could withstand. The world with its secrets spread open before me, and fate was but wax in my hands. Each new surge of blood as it pounded within me lured me on with its shimmering hues, while the faith in my heart, like a building deserted, crumbled, soundless, and slipped into ruin. But picking my way between life and extinction, now falling, now scrambling back, I gaze through new eyes at the life I once followed, and gazing, I shudder with thanks. It was not my own intellect, not my desiring, that it illumined each twist in my path, but the still even light of a higher design that only with time I could grasp. And now, as I sit with newfound moderation from the life-giving waters, I see that my faith is restored, O Lord of creation. I renounced you, but you stood by me. So this is a poem he writes after all that he's been through, all of the suffering. And from this moment onward, he becomes a courageous warrior for Christ against the forces of tyranny. He begins to write. And in the 1960s, books are published that are banned in the Soviet Union, but are smuggled out and published in the West. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which if you're looking to read something by Solzhenitsyn, is probably the easiest because it's a short novella. And as the title would suggest, it's just one typical day in a labor camp. But it's a mystical engagement with suffering, with what freedom is. You know, basically the prison guards really are the slaves. And you have a Christian character there who feels it a blessing to be able to suffer for Christ. And then First Circle, I've mentioned the novel First Circle. He wrote about that experience in the comfortable prison. Cancer Ward, about his experience of what he thought was terminal cancer. He wrote a wonderful play called Candle in the Wind. And it's basically about neuroscience. And there's a woman, the character, and she's highly strung, and she's suffering because of a highly strung personality. So the brain surgeons, the neurosurgeons operate on her brain. And when they're finished, she's happy. But she's happy because she's comfortably numb, to take a couple of words from Pink Floyd, if you're if you know anything about The Wall. I have become comfortably numb. No, so what was better? To be fully human and suffering, or to be stripped of part of your humanity in order to become comfortable? And then probably his most important work is the Gulag Archipelago, and published in 3 chunky volumes throughout the 70s and early 80s, which documented the horrors of Soviet communism. And again, one of the tragedies of our own time is that we have decided to suffer from collective amnesia about the recent past and are stumbling blindly towards a resurrection of what could become a socialist nightmare because we have not learned the lessons of the past. In 1970, Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And at around the same time, the KGB, the Soviet secret police, attempted to assassinate him with a new toxin. You put it on the skin and it would just kill you. We didn't know about this, but in my first edition of my book, this is not in there because this only came out with the opening of the KGB files following the fall of the Soviet Union. That toxin was actually perfected later, and it was necessary to break the skin. And some of you may remember, and I can't remember his name now, but he was a diplomat from maybe Bulgaria during the Soviet Union, and he was in London and was stabbed with an umbrella. They had this same toxin that they used on Solzhenitsyn on the tip, and he died. So in 1974, he's charged with treason by the Soviet Union and expelled from the country. He lives for a short time in Switzerland and then moves to the United States and lives in Vermont in the United States until his return to Russia in 1994. One of the key factors in his life was the Harvard address. In 1978, he gave a speech, a graduation address to the students of Harvard. It was raining, but there were thousands of people listening. He was such a giant figure. And while he was just attacking the Soviet Union, he was seen as being okay as a hero. but he turned his finger and said that the West is also committing collective suicide, that the decadence of the West is basically going to be as destructive as the communism of the East, and that the West had to turn its back on its path towards self-destruction in what St. John Paul II would call the culture of death, and Pope Benedict XVI would call the dictatorship of relativism. So Solzhenitsyn, and then from that moment onwards, the Western media turned on him and vilified him. Which is why, and I'm going to now move to this last part of the talk, to the subjective part, my own experience with Solzhenitsyn, which is why I was astonished that I got the chance to interview him. When I wrote to him back in that, probably 1997, I was still living in England at the time. When I wrote to him, I have no idea now how I even found his address. His postal address in Russia, but somehow I got his address. And when I wrote to him asking if I could interview him because I'd like to write a biography of him, I was not expecting to receive a reply, because at this point he had not given any interview to a Western writer for years, because he basically said they're all lying, they're all just basically telling lies and manipulating his words and not interested in the truth. So he said, well, I just won't bother to talk to you. My view was that I write to him, and best case scenario is he writes back saying thanks but no thanks, and I've got his signature, and as a fan that would be sufficient. What I said in my letter, at the time I wrote to him, I only had one book published. That was my biography of GK Chesterton. So obviously I mentioned that because that's the only CV I had that was that would add any weight to my request. But I said that I didn't think that any of the previous biographies of him had paid due attention to his Christianity, to the centrality of his Christianity, to his life and the courage of his life. So imagine my surprise when he wrote back and said, yes, by all means, come to Russia, interview me, gave me the contact details of two of his sons who were raised in the United States and educated in England and spoke English fluently. And so armed with this letter, I went to my publisher in England, HarperCollins, as it was then, waved this letter in front of them and said, you have to give me a contract to write this biography, and you have to give me an additional £5,000 so I can afford to go to Moscow, to Russia, to interview him. And they see in the letter, they agreed with that. So I arrive, I'm still very surprised. Why me? Why is he giving an interview to me, not all the very seasoned writers and journalists that have contacted him? I thought it must be because he agrees that previous biographies have not paid due attention to his Christian faith. But before he actually arrives, before he came downstairs when I got to his house, his wife took me to another room, and she showed me in the top shelf in this other room the Ignatius Press collected works of GK Chesterton. So I did not know, I don't think anybody in the world knew at that point, that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was a fan of GK Chesterton. And it was that magic word Chesterton which had given me access to the great man Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So that's another reason for my being thankful for Chesterton, because I always say that my biography of Chesterton was an act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. Under grace, Chesterton is the biggest single influence on my conversion. That's why he's looking over my shoulder here. But he also gave me access to Solzhenitsyn. So we had this interview, you know, we're sitting around a table. He's opposite me and his son is to my left and his right. And I would ask my questions to him, looking in his eye in English. He would, then Yermolai would translate into Russian, and he would then reply in Russian, looking at me. Yermolai would then reply in English. But I could tell Solzhenitsyn understood what I was saying. His English was much better than we might think. I just think he wanted to make sure that he wasn't giving his replies in a sort of less than perfect English, which might lead to misunderstanding. But once or twice he corrected his son. No, that's not what I said, you know. So his English was certainly good. But one thing about Solzhenitsyn, my personal experience of him going there, was we had this image of him as a sort of a stern Jeremiah type prophet of doom. There aren't any or many photographs of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn smiling. He looks too serious. And yet what I saw, there was his eyes. First of all, when I met him, he was 79 years old, a few months away from his 80th birthday. But his eyes, china blue, very handsome eyes, were youthful on the surface and glinting with a mischievous look in them. And he had this infectious chuckle that accompanied his words, a great deal of humor. His sons told me that he has a great gift as a mimic, and he would mimic TV personalities or politicians so well and so convincingly that they would be rolling on the floor in laughter. So there's this whole other side of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. At least tried my best to bring that side out. So, and the other thing about him, I remember holding his eyes, holding his gaze. And I've also written a few books on J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. And there's a character in the Lord of the Rings called Treebeard. And he's lived for thousands and thousands of years. And there's a description in the Lord of the Rings of his eyes, when one of the hobbits meets his eyes, and this sort of almost youthful buoyancy on the surface, but as you hold the gaze, there's millennia of experience, depth of wisdom. That's exactly what I got when I looked and held Solzhenitsyn's gaze. On the surface, he was almost youthful. His blue eyes, very alive, very buoyant, almost like a young man's. But when you held the gaze, you perceived wells and wells of experience, of suffering, of wisdom, and of holiness. Now, of course, I don't know. I said we started this about objective and subjective. I don't know whether that was really there objectively or whether I was projecting that there from my own imagination. But either way, that was the experience I had. So to return to our first questions, do great men make history? Yes. That's not necessarily a good thing, though. Perhaps Joseph Stalin was a great man. Perhaps Adolf Hitler was a great man. What constitutes greatness? Solzhenitsyn is a great man. And I don't know if you've heard of, I'm sure you've heard of it. I don't know if you've read George Orwell's book, 1984. But what I find really, really encouraging about the great man who is Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is he reminds me of the character of Winston Smith, the character in who stands up to Big Brother in 1984. The difference is, however, and ironically, when George Orwell was writing that book, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was lying on his back in a prison bunk in the third year of his 7 years. And he had already decided he was going to bring down the Soviet Empire. He was going to be the St. George who slays the dragon. He couldn't write. He wasn't given materials to write. He was memorizing thousands of lines of poetry in his head. He was writing in his mind because he had nothing to write down. And the difference between Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and Winston Smith is in 1984, Big Brother wins. Winston Smith is crushed. He betrays everything, himself, the woman he loves, his own beliefs. Big Brother triumphs. In the real world, an individual prisoner in the Soviet labor system emerges from prison, becomes a witness against the tyrants and the tyranny. And he says in the 1970s, when the Soviet Union is at the height of its power, I will return to Russia after the Soviet Union does not exist. And those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War will know that they seemed like words of madness. It seemed that the Cold War was a stable scenario, not necessarily a good one. You had NATO on one side and the Soviet bloc on the other. It'd been there for decades and it wasn't going away. And then it collapses almost overnight. And Solzhenitsyn, the prophet, not of doom now, but the prophet of the triumph of good over evil, returns home to his native land. So just to finish, I remember before my first book, back in England, and Chesterton was published, I remember praying, Lord, I've done many bad things in my life. If this one book could be published, I will actually think that I've done something worthwhile, something paying homage to the good, the true, and the beautiful, and to you. And my life will be complete. I'll ask no more. And if then I could have been given a blank page and given all your own wishes, write down how you want your life to be over the next 25 years. It would not have been as good and as blessed as it has been. And that includes, by the way, suffering, includes having a daughter who was stillborn, includes 4 miscarriages for my wife. It's not that the suffering has been part of the blessing. The point is, I would have lacked the imagination, given a blank page, to write my life as well as God has written it. And what I would not have been able to imagine in my wildest dreams is that through GK Chesterton and through the writing of that book, I would get the key to visit one of my great heroes and one of the great heroes of the 20th century, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. God has blessed me through suffering. God has blessed Alexander through suffering. God blesses all of us through suffering. It's only through the crucifixion that we get to the resurrection. Thank you so much.
Well, Mr. Pearce, I am truly grateful to you for sharing your message with us today. It was fabulous. I myself struggle sometimes with helping non-believers understand the purpose and the necessity of suffering and the blessings that can come from that. So you've definitely helped me have a better perspective on that. And somebody who is not familiar with Solzhenitsyn, I also appreciate learning more about him and his heroism and what we can all learn from that. So yeah, thank you so much. At this point, I will open up the meeting to some questions and answers. We don't have to be completely formal with this, but there is an option. It should be either at the bottom or the top of your screen. It says reactions. If you click on that, you can raise your hand, and we already have a hand raised. So Deborah, if you want to go ahead, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. Mr. Pearce, thank you so much for your talk. I had now limited knowledge of Solzhenitsyn, but you gave me so much more. But I have a question. Can you tell me what lessons can be learned from Solzhenitsyn's life for us today?
Yeah. Yes, I think the most important one is the fact that it's only through the acceptance and embrace of suffering that we grow in the spiritual life. There's one of my favorite novelists is someone called Maurice Baring. He was a great friend of Chesterton and Belloc, and he wrote quite a number of best-selling novels between the 2 world wars, largely forgotten now, which is scandalous, A Convert to Catholicism. But in his final novel, there's a priest character, and the priest character says, the acceptance of sorrow is the secret of life. When you understand that, you will understand everything. So not sorrow, not suffering, but the acceptance of suffering. That's the key. In other words, we have to respond with humility to the suffering that we receive. And that, of course, is only possible with the help of God's grace, which means it's very difficult for one to grow from the experience of suffering without a relationship with Christ. One of the many reasons why being a Christian helps us cope with the sufferings of life. The other thing I would say, however, Deborah, as well, is that we are lurching towards secular fundamentalism at the moment in the United States and indeed other countries. And this is only possible because of a collective amnesia of what happens when we embrace secular fundamentalism. We forgot the lessons of the French Revolution, and then we got the Bolshevik Revolution, and then we got the Chinese Communist Revolution, and the number of civilians killed by their own government in the 20th century is in the tens of millions. And how we can have forgotten that and be taking the same path that was taken a century ago beggars belief. But it does show the dangers of not learning the lessons of history, which is why learning the lessons that Solzhenitsyn teaches is so important.
Thank you. We have another question from Thomas Donnelly. Thomas, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. I can do it for you if you want.
Hey, please.
There you go.
Hello.
Hello, Thomas.
Well, actually, I'm Thomas's friend, Jack, and I just want to say that Solzhenitsyn was an unbelievable man, and Gilbert Chesterton was an unbelievably, he was bigger than life in more ways than one. But I just want to tell you, I have read many nonfiction books in my life. I've never read any that were better written and more professionally notated and put together than those two books. And my congratulations to you.
Well, thank you so much. So you're referring up to my biography of Chesterton, my biography of Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
Jack, thanks so much. I can tell you that the thing about being a writer, I'm giving a talk now, you get instant feedback. When you're a writer, when you write a book, it goes off to publish, you're not there when people read it. So in many ways, the encouragement I gain most encouragement from is when somebody who's read my books says what you just said. It makes me feel vindicated, and it makes all the effort worthwhile. Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I actually have a question. The one quote that you mentioned in the beginning was, it really caught my attention, and I'm wondering if you can expand your thoughts on it. And that is, the liberty itself must be limited to be possessed. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm actually very pleased that you've asked that question, because, you know, I'm trying to be very strict with myself. I'm not going beyond 45 minutes with a talk, because even if you're giving a good talk, there's a law of diminishing returns that sets in after that, and people get, you know. So I wanted to talk about this. One of the key components of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's political philosophy that he calls on, he wrote books such as Rebuilding Russia and Russia in the Abyss, and other books that talk about how do we get out of the mess that we're in. And one of his key ideas is what he calls self-limitation. And that's, first of all, self-limitation on the part of individuals. And that's ultimately the most important thing, because without that, nothing else can be built from it. But also the self-limitation of governments. In other words, that we have to get away from believing that more is best. I remember there was someone said once that those people who believe that more and onward and that's the way to progress, more onward. So that's the moronic approach, the moronic approach to happiness. Basically, you know, that we do know that if we actually limit ourselves, we don't do what we want, but do what we should do, we are actually much happier then when we completely do what we like. The path of least resistance does lead to hell, and not just the hell in the hereafter, but the hell in the here and now. Now, if we decide that we are going to cheat on our wives or use drugs or get drunk and not bother to turn up for work and what have you, we turn our lives into a misery. So the only way we can actually acquire happiness is by voluntarily self-limiting us. So self-limitation is a key component of Solzhenitsyn's worldview, and that obviously ties in with Edmund Burke's liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. If we do our own thing, we make our life a misery, we make everybody else's life a misery. That's the problem.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love that quote. And it's something I think I'm going to be putting on a sticky note all around my house. We have another question from Neil Fico. Neil, can you unmute yourself? And if not, I can do it. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Neil, yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think is the comparisons on Russia and China right now, and how the persecutions of Christians there will kind of manifest itself in the future. And, you know, how many Alexander Solzhenitsyns may come out of China in the future?
Well, that's a great question. I do think it's absolutely crucial that we distinguish between Russia and China. China is still a communist country. Russia is not. If you want the idea of a miracle, that if you're a realist, then Christianity should be dead in Russia. You know, from 1917 until 1991. So my math isn't good. That's why I do literature. 74 years. You know, for 74 years, the Soviet Union was an atheistic system where people were brainwashed into atheism, where Christianity was illegal to one degree or another, where Christians were put in prison or tortured and murdered. It should all be over. Nobody in 1991 remembered Christian Russia. And yet the Russian Orthodox Church now is a major political as well as spiritual force in Russia, and it's a major force towards conservatism. One of the reasons that the Pride agenda, the radical relativism of the LGBT movement is not getting traction there is because of the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church and its place. Russia, in terms of morals, is actually certainly sexual morality is actually far ahead of us, far more. I don't like the word conservative, but far more conservative than we are. So you have to separate the two. China, on the other hand, is still a communist tyranny. It's scandalous. There's a book I would recommend by Cardinal Zen, who is the now retired Cardinal Archbishop of Hong Kong. And he talks about the underground church and the witness of the underground church in China. The church is in the catacombs. And under Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the church was very forceful in supporting the church in the catacombs. Unfortunately, today, it seems that the Roman Curia is in bed with the Chinese Communist Party and is cooperating with the Chinese Communist Party's basically state-controlled Catholic Church, and has largely betrayed the Christians in the catacombs. But again, the number of Christians in China, considering now, again, 70 years, in 1948, was it? The Chinese Communist Revolution, 48 or 49. So this is 70 years plus. And of course, China was never, unlike Russia, was never a Christian country. So what we see going on in China now is massive evangelization in the catacombs. And the Christian presence in China is vibrant and dynamic. And I think it will be a major ingredient in the bringing down of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not going to be a prophet like Solzhenitsyn and suggest when that might be.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you. We have another question from Deacon Mark Thompson. Deacon, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. This is more of a thank you than a question. I was introduced to you, Mr. Pearce, through your book, Race with the Devil, by a friend through Cursillo. And through that book, it gave me the courage and confidence to say yes when I was called and asked to be a deacon. So thank you very much for that book. You made a big difference in my life.
Well, thank you so much, Deacon. Again, it means a great deal for me to hear that. I'm always reminded when I hear witness of what you've just said and things similar of the words we say in the Mass, Domine non sum dignus, Lord, I am not worthy. So thank you. It's again, comments such as that make my day. So I'm gonna be happy for the rest of the day. So thank you. God bless.
Okay, I do not see any other raised hands, so I'm just going to put it out there one more time. If anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, you may do so at this time. Again, just ask that you use the raise hand option so people aren't speaking on top of each other. Does anyone else have any other questions? And if you aren't familiar with the raise hand option, you can also put a question in the chat box. Deborah, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to ask another one?
No, I just, I don't want to talk over anybody, but I do want to make a final comment. So let me know.
Well, there are no other hands raised. There are no other items in the chat box, so the table's yours.
Okay. Joseph, I want to thank you so much for your talk. This educational session was the best attended that we've had. And we are so encouraged, not only by what you said, but by you. We are grateful for your time, and thank you again.
My pleasure, Deborah. It was a joy to get to meet you when you came to see me. So
It was fun.
yes, I'm still in the afterglow of that. So God bless you.
Yes, I also want to thank you and just ask that God continue to bless you in your talent and in your future endeavors. At this point, this will draw this meeting to a close. Now, I do want to make a note. Anyone who is on the School of Leaders ad hoc committee or on the School of Leaders is a facilitator for your deanery. I'm going to ask that you please stay on the meeting. Other than that, that concludes the meeting. So if you click on your red button that says leave, you're welcome to do that now. And I hear lots of people are starting to do that. Joseph, did you have any last words you wanted to say?
Merely to say thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy and a wonderful time, a wonderful way of spending an hour or so on a Saturday morning with friends. So thanks so much, everybody. God bless you all, and please do pray for me.
Absolutely. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. You have a great day now.